The morning sun rises over the Sinai Peninsula on October 6, 1973. The air is sharp and cold, typical for a desert dawn. Israeli tank crews scan the horizon through their periscopes, bored and confident. The Yom Kippur holiday has left the Suez Canal eerily quiet. Across the water, Egyptian positions look the same as they have for 6 years: static, defensive, irrelevant. The tankers don't know it yet, but in less than 3 hours, one of them will watch his commander's turret explode into the sky, propelled by a weapon so simple it could fit in a suitcase, and he will have no idea what killed them. This is the story of how a Soviet-designed anti-tank missile, dismissed by Western intelligence as crude and ineffective, destroyed the most advanced armor doctrine in the world, killed the myth of tank invincibility, and rewrote the rules of modern combat in a single afternoon. It's about asymmetry, arrogance, and the moment when military genius discovered it had been outsmarted by simplicity. And it begins with absolute dominance. By October 1973, the Israeli Defense Forces had spent 6 years basking in perhaps the most lopsided military victory of the 20th century. The Six-Day War of 1967 wasn't just a win, it was a humiliation delivered with surgical precision. Israeli armor had carved through Egyptian, Syrian, and Jordanian positions like a scalpel through silk. Combined arms doctrine, superior training, aggressive maneuver warfare, the IDF had demonstrated that modern mechanized combat belonged to those who mastered speed and coordination. The mythology that followed was almost biblical. Israeli tanks didn't just win battles. They won so fast, the enemy couldn't process what was happening. At the heart of this dominance sat the tank itself, the Centurion, the Patton, the Super Sherman. Heavy, powerful, armored beasts that could absorb punishment and deliver devastation. Israeli doctrine treated the tank as the king of the battlefield, supported by infantry and air power, but never subordinate to them. The tank advanced. Everything else followed. Egyptian forces, meanwhile, had been shattered so thoroughly in 1967 that their military rebuilt from psychological rubble. Soviet advisors flooded in. Equipment was replaced. Doctrine was rewritten. But Israeli intelligence watched all of this with clinical detachment. Egypt could rebuild all it wanted. Tanks would win. Tanks always won. This wasn't arrogance for its own sake. It was empirically justified confidence. The United States and NATO agreed. Armor superiority determined outcomes. The Soviets knew it too, which is why they manufactured tanks by the thousands. Everyone understood the equation. If you controlled the armor, you controlled the battlefield. Egyptian infantry had been helpless in 1967. They would be helpless again. Now, if you're already hooked, do me a favor and hit that like button. I promise you, this story goes places you won't expect, and the algorithm needs to know you're invested. Let's continue. By late 1973, Israeli defensive positions along the Suez Canal operated on a simple assumption. Egypt couldn't cross. The Bar-Lev Line, a series of fortifications running along the eastern bank, wasn't designed to stop a full invasion. It was designed to delay one long enough for Israeli armor to arrive and annihilate the crossing forces. History suggested this would take hours at most. Egyptian bridging equipment was Soviet-made and cumbersome. Egyptian coordination was poor. Egyptian morale was questionable. The Bar-Lev Line wasn't a wall. It was a tripwire connected to the most lethal mobile defense force in the region. October 6, 1973, 2 p.m., Egyptian artillery erupts along the entire length of the canal. Over 2,000 guns fire simultaneously, a rolling thunder that shakes the earth and blinds Israeli observation posts. This is expected. Artillery barrages precede attacks. Israeli doctrine accounted for this. Tanks would weather the bombardment in defilade positions and emerge when the barrage lifted. Then the killing would begin. Except the barrage doesn't lift. It sustains. And through the smoke and dust, something impossible starts happening. Egyptian engineers are crossing the canal. Not slowly, not tentatively, but in waves. Rubber boats, pontoon bridges, prefabricated spans, they're crossing everywhere at once. Israeli defenders call for armor support. The tanks are coming. They're always coming. But, as the Egyptian infantry reaches the eastern bank, they don't dig in defensively. They don't wait for their own armor to catch up. They spread out in small teams, carrying boxes and tubes, and they start moving toward Israeli tank positions with a speed and confidence that makes no tactical sense. The first Israeli tanks arrive, engines roaring, treads churning sand. Commanders scan for targets. Egyptian armor hasn't crossed yet. Perfect. Engaging infantry without anti-tank support is a slaughter. The gunners prepare to fire. And then something streaks across the desert floor, impossibly fast, leaving a thin trail of smoke. The lead tank explodes. Not a mobility kill, not a track blown off. Total catastrophic destruction. The turret lifts into the air like a child's toy and crashes down meters away. Secondary explosions cook off ammunition. Smoke billows black and thick. The second tank in line tries to identify the source of fire. Another streak. Another explosion. Then another. Within 90 seconds, an entire platoon of Israeli armor is burning, and nobody knows what's shooting at them. Radio discipline collapses. Commanders scream for air support, for artillery, for someone to explain what's happening. Egyptian infantry teams are visible now, kneeling in the open, holding what look like briefcases with antennas. They're not running. They're not hiding. They're aiming. And Israeli tanks, the kings of mobile warfare, are dying faster than their crews can process. This is the moment. This is the crack in the foundation, the anomaly. Israeli doctrine had no framework for this. Anti-tank weapons existed, of course. Recoilless rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, even early guided missiles. But those weapons were slow, inaccurate, required static positions, and could be suppressed with machine gun fire. You didn't halt a tank advance with infantry portable weapons. You slowed it down. You harassed it. You died bravely and delayed the inevitable. But these weapons aren't slow. They're tracking. The missiles adjust mid-flight, following Israeli tanks as they attempt evasive maneuvers. Smoke screens don't help. Speed doesn't help. Distance doesn't help. Egyptian infantry are engaging from ranges where tank machine guns can't effectively return fire, and they're scoring kill after kill with a precision that seems guided by something beyond human capability. Because it is. The AT-3 Sagger, designated 9K-11 Malyutka by Soviet nomenclature, was a wire-guided anti-tank missile that NATO intelligence had known about since the mid-1960s. Reports described it as interesting but limited. The operator had to remain stationary and guide the missile manually using a small joystick, keeping the crosshairs on the target while the missile flew along a wire that spooled out behind it. This required nerves of steel, extraordinary focus, and exposure to enemy fire for up to 30 seconds per shot. Western analysts considered it a weapon that might work in controlled conditions but would crumble under real combat stress. Soviet doctrine agreed, mostly. The Sagger was issued to infantry units as a defensive tool, a way to blunt enemy armor, while Soviet tanks maneuvered. Nobody expected it to be decisive. Egypt had other ideas. For 6 years, Egyptian forces had trained obsessively with the Sagger, not as a supplement to armor, but as a primary offensive weapon. Infantry teams drilled until they could set up, fire, guide, and pack up in under 2 minutes. They practiced engaging moving targets at maximum range. They learned to work in pairs, with one operator guiding while another prepared a follow-up shot. Soviet advisors watched this training with bemusement. The Egyptians were over-investing in a niche weapon, but Egyptian commanders understood something deeper. They didn't need to match Israeli armor strength. They needed to nullify it. And the Sagger, wielded with sufficient skill and numbers, could turn Israeli tanks from an unstoppable advantage into a fatal liability. On October 6th, across the Sinai, that theory became practice. Egyptian infantry teams fired over 200 Saggers in the first 3 hours of combat. Israeli tank losses were catastrophic. Entire companies ceased to exist. Commanders who had spent careers perfecting maneuver doctrine found themselves pinned down, unable to advance or retreat without exposing their flanks to more missile fire. The psychological effect was worse than the material damage. Tankers stopped trusting their armor. They hesitated. They second-guessed. The weapon that had made them invincible was now a metal coffin, and Israeli high command had no idea what was killing them. Field reports came in fragmented and confused. Commanders reported missiles, but the descriptions varied wildly. Some said they saw explosions from hidden positions. Others swore Egyptian infantry were firing from the open. Some claimed the weapons were rocket-propelled grenades, impossibly accurate. Others insisted they were seeing remote-controlled missiles, which was theoretically possible but had never been demonstrated effectively in combat. Intelligence officers tried to reconcile the reports and found themselves facing a picture that didn't fit any known threat assessment. The truth was too simple to believe. A man with a joystick was outfighting a tank. Before we go further, I want you to do something. Pause for a second and think about what would happen if this engagement was happening today. How would modern doctrine handle this? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm genuinely curious what you think, and I read every single one. Now, let's talk about what happened next. Israeli reserves mobilized with desperate speed. The plan was simple. Bring overwhelming armor strength to bear. Crush the Egyptian bridgeheads and restore the defensive line. If Egyptian infantry had some new anti-tank capability, the solution was more tanks, more fire support, more aggression. Mechanized Warfare 101. You don't retreat from asymmetric threats. You overpower them. October 7th. Israeli armor counterattacks along multiple axes, supported by artillery and airstrikes. The doctrine is sound. The execution is professional. The result is a disaster. Sagger teams have multiplied. Egyptian forces crossed the canal with thousands of missiles, and now those missiles are everywhere. Israeli tanks advancing across open desert find themselves under fire from multiple directions simultaneously. The Sagger's range, 3 kilometers, means Egyptian infantry can engage before Israeli tanks close to effective firing distance. Worse, the missile's flight time, roughly 20 to 30 seconds, gives Egyptian operators enough control to adjust for evasive maneuvers. Israeli tanks try to jink and weave, changing speed and direction, but the missiles follow. Smoke screens create brief windows of safety, but Egyptian teams simply wait for the smoke to clear or shift to alternate targets. The mathematics are brutal. A Sagger costs roughly $800 to manufacture. A Centurion tank costs $250,000. The exchange rate is obscene. Egyptian forces are trading pocket change for strategic assets, and they're doing it faster than Israel can replace losses. By October 8th, Israeli armored brigades that had entered combat at full strength were reduced to 30, 40, sometimes 20% combat effectiveness. Not because they were outfought in maneuver combat, but because they couldn't reach the enemy. The fundamental assumption of tank warfare that mobility and armor allowed you to close with and destroy the enemy, had been inverted. Egyptian infantry didn't need to close. They reached out across kilometers of desert and deleted Israeli armor from existence. And still, Israeli command struggled to accept what was happening. Denial is a powerful force in military organizations. Accepting that your core doctrine has been invalidated requires institutional humility that few militaries possess, especially in the middle of a war. Israeli intelligence began circulating alternative explanations. Perhaps Soviet advisors were operating the missiles. Perhaps the Egyptians had received advanced targeting systems that NATO didn't know about. Perhaps the losses were inflated, the result of panic and confusion rather than actual combat effectiveness. Then, the evidence arrived. Captured Egyptian positions yielded intact Sagger launchers. Israeli engineers examined them with growing disbelief. The weapon was shockingly simple. A tube, a wire spool, a small joystick, a battery. No advanced optics, no computer assistance, no radar guidance, just wire and human skill. The missile itself was barely sophisticated. A small warhead, a solid rocket motor, and control surfaces actuated by signals sent through the wire. It was, in engineering terms, almost primitive. And it was killing main battle tanks with contemptuous ease. Intelligence agencies worldwide took notice. If Egypt could do this with basic Soviet hardware and intense training, what did that mean for NATO's armored divisions facing the full weight of Soviet mechanized forces? The implications were staggering. The Cold War's central military assumption that armored maneuver would define European combat suddenly looked fragile. Israel adapted because survival demanded it. Doctrine shifted almost overnight. Tanks began operating with infantry screens whose sole job was to identify and suppress Sagger teams before they could fire. Artillery shifted from supporting maneuver to hunting anti-tank positions. Air support prioritized close air support missions, hitting suspected missile sites with cluster munitions and napalm. It worked, partially. Israeli forces regained offensive momentum, but the cost was irreversible. The age of tank supremacy had ended. Armor would never again advance across open ground with the confidence it had before October 6, 1973. Egyptian forces, meanwhile, were learning their own lessons. The Saggers' success had been spectacular, but it had limits. The weapon required line of sight, which meant operators were exposed to return fire. Israeli adaptation meant Sagger teams faced increasingly lethal suppression efforts, and most critically, the Sagger couldn't exploit success. It could stop tanks, but it couldn't take ground. Egyptian armor, when it finally crossed the canal in strength, found itself facing the same Israeli tanks they had spent days destroying. Except now those tanks were supported by infantry, artillery, and air power coordinated specifically to counter wire-guided missiles. The October War ended in a messy, complicated stalemate that would eventually lead to peace negotiations. But the tactical revolution it demonstrated continued to reverberate. Now let's talk about why the Sagger worked, because the physics here are genuinely fascinating, and they explain why this weapon changed everything. Wire-guided missile technology wasn't new in 1973. The concept dated back to World War II, with experimental German designs. The principle is elegant. The operator visually tracks the target and steers the missile using a control input. Originally a joystick, later more sophisticated systems. The missile receives course corrections through a thin wire that unspools as it flies, keeping it connected to the launcher. When the operator's crosshairs align with the target, the missile impacts. The challenge is human. You're asking a soldier, under fire, to maintain visual focus on a moving target for up to 30 seconds, while smoothly adjusting a control stick to keep a small, fast-moving object on course. Any overcorrection causes the missile to oscillate. Any loss of nerve means a miss. And the operator must remain completely stationary and exposed because movement disrupts aim. In theory, this would be nearly impossible under combat conditions. In practice, Egyptian soldiers proved it wasn't. The key was training intensity that bordered on obsessive. Egyptian Sagger operators trained for months, firing practice rounds until the muscle memory became automatic. They learned to breathe slowly, to ignore incoming fire, to trust the wire. Soviet advisors had underestimated the human factor. Given sufficient repetition, soldiers could perform under stress what seemed impossible in theory. Egypt didn't just issue Saggers to infantry. They built an entire tactical system around them. The missile itself exploited fundamental physics. Tank armor is designed to defeat kinetic penetrators and shaped charge warheads by dispersing energy across thick, sloped plates. But the Sagger's heat warhead, high-explosive anti-tank, used a shaped charge that focused explosive energy into a superheated jet of metal plasma capable of punching through hundreds of millimeters of armor. The physics of this is brutal and elegant. When the warhead detonates, the explosive collapses a copper cone into a narrow jet moving at kilometers per second. This jet doesn't melt through armor. It punches through via sheer kinetic force, creating a shockwave inside the tank that turns the crew compartment into a kill zone. Secondary explosions from ammunition and fuel do the rest. Israeli tanks in 1973 had armor designed to defeat the anti-tank weapons of the 1960s. The Sagger's warhead was a generation ahead, and the standoff range meant tanks couldn't suppress the launch teams before they fired. The engagement geometry favored the missile, always. And here's the economic brutality that changed modern warfare forever. A Sagger missile cost $800. The launcher, reusable and simple, added maybe $2,000 to the total system cost. Training an operator was expensive in time, but cheap in resources. Egypt could field hundreds of Sagger teams for the cost of a single tank company. And each team could, theoretically, destroy multiple tanks before being neutralized. An Israeli Centurion tank cost $250,000 in 1973 money. Training the crew took months. Replacing a destroyed tank required international supply chains, foreign aid, and strategic reserves. The exchange rate was approximately 300 to 1 in Egypt's favor. 300 missiles for the economic cost of one tank. Even accounting for misses, suppression, and operational failures, the mathematics were devastating. This is the essence of asymmetric warfare. You don't match your enemy's strengths. You exploit the gap between their capabilities and their vulnerabilities. Israel's strength was armored maneuver. The vulnerability was that armor, no matter how sophisticated, must close with the enemy to fight. The Sagger turned that closing distance into a kill zone. NATO strategists watched this unfold with cold horror. Soviet doctrine fielded tanks in numbers that dwarfed Israeli forces. If Soviet infantry could replicate Egyptian success with Saggers, and they had far more of them, then NATO's entire defensive strategy for Central Europe was compromised. The nightmare scenario became clear. Soviet armor advances, NATO armor moves to intercept, and Soviet infantry destroy NATO tanks faster than replacements can arrive. The nuclear threshold, previously assumed to require Soviet breakthroughs, suddenly looked much closer. The response was predictable and expensive. Western militaries poured resources into countermeasures. Tank armor got thicker and more sophisticated, incorporating reactive armor that detonates outward to disrupt shaped charge jets. Active protection systems were developed, designed to intercept incoming missiles before impact. Doctrine shifted to emphasize combined arms at smaller unit levels, ensuring tanks never operated without infantry support. Helicopter gunships became critical, providing a way to engage anti-tank teams from angles they couldn't defend against. But the deeper lesson was psychological. Tank crews would never again feel invincible. The mythology of armored dominance died in the Sinai, killed by men with briefcases. Let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about this before you comment below. If you were designing a modern military, knowing what you know now, how much would you invest in traditional armor versus infantry anti-tank capabilities? There's no right answer, but the question itself explains why defense budgets exploded in the late 1970s. Drop your thought process in the comments. I'm genuinely curious where you land on this. The Sagger's success didn't end in the Sinai. The weapon proliferated wildly throughout the 1970s and 1980s, appearing in conflicts across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Soviet client states received thousands. Revolutionary movements acquired them through black markets and proxy suppliers. The weapon's simplicity made it nearly impossible to control. You didn't need sophisticated infrastructure to operate a Sagger. You needed a team, a target, and the nerve to stay exposed while guiding. In Angola, Sagger teams knocked out South African armor during the border war. In Lebanon, various factions used them against Israeli and Syrian forces. In Afghanistan, Mujahideen fighters acquired early models and used them against Soviet armor, though with less success due to the mountainous terrain limiting line of sight. The weapon became a symbol of asymmetric resistance, proof that infantry could contest mechanized forces if equipped and trained properly. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, drew its own conclusions. The Sagger had proven the concept, but its limitations were clear. Wire guidance required line of sight and left operators exposed. The next generation needed to fix this. Development accelerated on fire-and-forget missiles, laser-guided systems, and top-attack profiles that struck tanks from above, where armor was thinnest. The AT-4 Spigot, AT-5 Spandrel, and eventually the AT-14 Cornet emerged, each iteration more sophisticated and lethal. Western development mirrored this evolution. The American TOW missile system, the European Milan, and later the Javelin represented parallel efforts to perfect infantry anti-tank capabilities. The Javelin, in particular, learned directly from the Sagger's lessons. Fire-and-forget guidance meant operators could shoot and relocate immediately, avoiding suppression. Top-attack mode meant even modern reactive armor couldn't fully protect tanks. The weapon cost $80,000 per missile, but it could kill multi-million-dollar tanks with near certainty. The economics remained absurd, but now both sides accepted it. Tanks would remain critical, but they would operate in environments where infantry could kill them at standoff range. The age of tank charges across open ground was over. Combined arms wasn't a preference. It was survival doctrine. And yet, the Sagger itself remained in service, because simplicity has its own virtue. The weapon required minimal maintenance, worked in extreme climates, and could be operated by soldiers with basic training. In resource-constrained militaries, the Sagger was good enough. Syrian forces still fielded them into the 2000s. Hezbollah used them against Israeli armor in the 2006 Lebanon War, scoring kills despite the decades-old design. The weapon had become a military fossil, still lethal, still relevant, still proving that sometimes the simplest solution is the most enduring. But the real legacy of the Sagger isn't the weapon itself. It's the doctrinal shift it forced. Before October 1973, military theorists debated the role of infantry in mechanized warfare. After October 1973, the debate was over. Infantry armed with anti-tank weapons weren't a supporting element. They were a primary combat arm, capable of shaping battles and determining outcomes. This realization cascaded through every aspect of military thinking. Urban warfare doctrine changed. Cities, previously seen as obstacles to armor, became fortresses where infantry anti-tank teams could dominate. Chechnya, Grozny, Fallujah, every urban battle of the late 20th and early 21st century saw infantry with anti-tank weapons bleeding mechanized forces in environments where armor's mobility meant nothing, and its vulnerabilities were absolute. Defensive doctrine changed. The idea that you could trade space for time while armor maneuvered to counterattack gave way to layered defenses, where anti-tank teams created kill zones that armor couldn't penetrate without prohibitive losses. The Gulf War demonstrated this in reverse. Coalition armor succeeded because air power systematically destroyed Iraqi anti-tank capabilities before the ground assault began. The lesson wasn't that tanks had regained supremacy. It was that tanks could only operate after the anti-tank threat was neutralized. Procurement priorities changed. Defense budgets that had poured billions into main battle tank development shifted resources toward infantry systems, reconnaissance assets, and precision strike capabilities. Tanks remained important, but they were no longer the centerpiece of military power. They were one element in a system that required air superiority, electronic warfare, infantry support, and artillery integration to function. Training changed. Tank crews learned to assume they were being targeted by guided missiles at all times. They practiced immediate suppression drills, smoke deployment, rapid displacement. The confidence of the 1960s, where tank commanders advanced with certainty, gave way to cautious, methodical tactics that prioritized survival over speed. And all of this traces back to October 6, 1973, when Egyptian infantry teams proved that a briefcase could kill a king. Now, here's the part that should genuinely disturb you, because it's not historical, it's current. The economic asymmetry that made the Sagger revolutionary has only intensified. Modern anti-tank missiles cost tens of thousands of dollars. Modern main battle tanks cost millions, sometimes tens of millions when you factor in training, maintenance, and support infrastructure. The exchange rate has barely changed. An American Javelin costs $80,000. An American M1 Abrams costs $9 million. The ratio is still over 100 to 1. Ukraine demonstrated this with brutal clarity. Turkish-made Bayraktar drones, costing $1 to $5 million each, destroyed Russian armor worth hundreds of millions. Infantry teams with javelins, NL autos, and other portable anti-tank systems turned Russian armored columns into scrap metal on the highways leading to Kyiv. The images were surreal. Multi-million-dollar tanks abandoned, destroyed, or captured, killed by weapons teams that could pack up and disappear into civilian areas within minutes. The lesson of the Sagger, 50 years later, remains unlearned by those who keep building tanks as if they're still the kings of battle. They're not. They're expensive targets in an environment where precision, mobility, and cost efficiency determine survival. Let's bring this home, because there's a deeper idea here that goes beyond missiles and tanks. The Sagger wasn't a miracle weapon. It was a simple tool used with extraordinary skill against an enemy who believed complexity equaled superiority. Israeli armor doctrine in 1973 was brilliant, sophisticated, and proven. It just didn't account for an enemy who refused to fight on Israel's terms. Egypt didn't try to out-tank the Israelis. They made tanks irrelevant. This pattern repeats throughout military history. The longbow at Crécy, the machine gun at the Somme. the aircraft carrier at Midway. Dominant paradigms collapse when someone changes the question. Israeli doctrine asked, "How do we maneuver armor to achieve decisive victory?" Egyptian doctrine asked, "How do we stop armor from maneuvering?" The second question was simpler, cheaper, and more effective. Modern military thinking still struggles with this. Defense establishments invest in exquisite platforms, aircraft carriers, stealth fighters, main battle tanks, designed to dominate conventional battlefields. And then they face adversaries who don't fight conventionally. Insurgents with IEDs, militants with drones, infantry with anti-tank missiles. The platforms are magnificent. They're also increasingly obsolete in the conflicts that actually happen. The Sagger's legacy is a warning. Sophistication is not the same as effectiveness. Sometimes the briefcase beats the tank. Sometimes simple, executed brilliantly, defeats complex, executed adequately. And sometimes the revolution in military affairs comes not from new technology, but from new thinking about old technology. On October 6, 1973, Egyptian soldiers knelt in the sand with joysticks and wire, and they killed an idea. The idea that armor was invincible. The idea that technological superiority guaranteed victory. The idea that military dominance could be maintained through platforms alone, without accounting for asymmetry, adaptation, and the human capacity to find vulnerabilities in any system. That idea is still dying. We keep rebuilding it in new forms, and reality keeps killing it with something simple, cheap, and unexpected. Before you go, do me one last favor. If this story changed how you think about military power, hit that subscribe button. I've got more deep dives into the moments that changed warfare, the battles that shouldn't have been won, and the weapons that rewrote the rules. And drop a comment telling me what conflict you want me to cover next. I read every single one, and your suggestions shape what I research. The Sagger missile, a briefcase with a wire, changed modern warfare in an afternoon. And somewhere, right now, someone is developing the next Sagger. The next simple tool that will kill the next invincible platform. The cycle continues. The lesson remains unlearned. And that might be the most dangerous weapon of all.